The period of origin, 1830 to 1880. Algeria was France's first and greatest experiment in her second colonial empire, and almost from the outset was important not only in itself but as shaping the country's general colonial policy. Unwelcome at first and not really arousing enthusiasm in France till the 80s, it was the testing ground of French policies and an experimental station in every field of activity: general administration, economic policy, native problems, and even because of the connection with a militant Islam, international problems in the period after 1870. So, naturally, the country came to occupy an especial position. It was never a colony and was never counted among the other colonies. Even today, this position remains and explains why it is practically impossible to obtain statistics covering the whole French Empire. Algeria has always been looked on as a prolongation of France, separated from France by a geographical accident of 30 hours of sea, but otherwise an integral portion of the mainland, and yet differentiated from a group of mainland departments by being a kind of laboratory for wider experiments unknown in France itself. The truth is that Algeria has always presented a case sui generis. It has not been a colony as the French view colonies. It is not a part of France under mainland conditions. Therefore, it has aptly been called a mixed colony, a colony half of settlement and half of exploitation, but with certain additional factors pertaining to neither of these types. But the best commentary on the anomalous situation of Algeria is that it is under the Minister of the Interior, yet has a distinct tariff regime. It is a piece of Islam thrust within the European orbit and looking not towards the center of Africa but northwards, and with its difficulties partly lessened but mostly increased by its proximity to the French mainland. At the outset, these confused characteristics best explain why Algeria's history has, for a century, been largely one of contradictions and futilities, with policies inapplicable to any colony and suicidal for a Muslim population. Algeria has been a synonym for confusion in French colonial annals, and by reason of its inordinate influence on colonial policy in general, has thus largely aided the anti-colonial cause. The one fixed feature of the situation throughout the century has been geography, which was in no small degree the determinant of policy, militarists on the spot and theorists in Paris notwithstanding. Algeria proper lies north of the desert, that is, north of the meridian through Biskra. South of that is the Sahara, the land of the raiding Tuareg, geographically distinct. Algeria itself is a double ridge of mountains between the desert and the sea. The Maritime Atlas and the Saharan Atlas traverse the country laterally and form a big double backbone. Between them is the plateau region of the Chat, the Haut Plateau, a steppe country too dry for agriculture and suitable only for scattered pasture, a forbidding land which is a fit portal of the desert. It is in the most northerly strip, the thin wedge of plain between the Maritime Atlas and the Mediterranean, that the wealth of the country lies, and that settlement has always been concentrated, especially in the wealthy Metidja region round Algiers itself. This coastal strip further subdivides into the provinces of Oran, Algiers, and Constantine, each of which has its distinct characteristics. Oran is the poor, dry section next to Morocco, with inert natives more prone to the forces of religious suggestion than elsewhere, but with the compensation of adequate supplies of Spanish and Moroccan laborers. At the other extremity, on the Tunisian border, is Constantine, a high-forested plateau region, with a people industrious, but because of the ruggedness of their country, more warrior-like and more independent than elsewhere. Consequently, this section is less suitable for outside colonization than the other two. Far more important than these two extremities is the central province, Algiers itself, for just as the colony of Algeria narrows down to the northern fringe, so in turn the north, to all intents and purposes, becomes the central province of Algiers, the region centering on the Metidja plain and the most densely settled part of Algeria. This is a land of exuberant vignerons and herders, with hard-working Kabyles further back and further back, still the harsh mountain tribes. But it is the black earth of the province that makes Algeria, and on this the occupation has focused from the first. Before 1870, Algeria had practically no record of success as far as the French were concerned. The country was occupied during a fit of ennui when the Bourbon government of Charles X attempted to distract the people's attention from maladministration at home, or more particularly, the uninteresting boredom of that administration, by filling their eyes with the sight of glamorous foreign adventures and an exotic eastern setting. The famous coup d'éventail, the blow given the French consul in Alger by the Dey, had little to do with the situation because it was by no means an isolated or even the worst of similar incivilities. More to the point was the question of the conflict between the French government and the Jewish banking house of Bakri and Buznak, who were the veritable rulers of Algeria, and aiding this trend was the effect of Moorish piracy on Mediterranean trade. A passing craze for la gloire and a permanent economic evil thus led France to Algeria. But once there, she wanted to leave and vacillated for decades. Only the Midi deputies, the commercialists, and the strategists wanted to remain, and even these were not concerned with the occupation of the interior of the land. Indeed, until 1840, it was not the pseudo-expansionists so much as the agrarians, the successors of the physiocrats and localists to the core, who decided the destiny of Algeria and who were supported by the serried ranks of the economists under Passy. It is true that the decision of a commission of inquiry in 1834 resulted in the maintenance of the conquest, but only half-heartedly. What Algeria meant to the mass of French statesmen was a perpetual war with Abdel-Kader for an ultimate victory which would aid nothing except French prestige, and that only to a dubious extent. Economically, there was nothing to hope for it was not known that the only plentiful thing in this desert was air, and even that foul. Under these conditions, the surprising feature is not that it took France 30 years to get to Kabylie, but that she ever got there at all. Until 1847, Abdel-Kader was in revolt. His defeat gave France the Tell Plains and the Algerian plateau, but Kabylie, the mountain land guarding the interior, was not occupied till 1857, and even then there had been little consolidation of the occupied area and not the slightest economic advance. For 30 years, the efforts of the French in Algeria had been limited to a barren use of force, and to 1869, the land had cost the lives of 150,000 soldiers and an equal number of colonists, and there was little to show for the wastage. In the interim, the bright spot was Bugeaud's command, 1841 to 1847, a period which was fruitful in colonization experiments. Pere Bugeaud, the petit caporal of Algeria, was a curious blend of farmer and soldier, with the instincts of a practical Période agriculturist and a weapon of 100,000 soldiers. These two assets he strove to combine in the form of the military colonization, but because his military training led him to overemphasize the influence of force, and because his Période days had bred in him a definite mistrust of outside capital, the scheme failed, and the credit of 3 million francs, which he demanded in 1847, was abruptly refused. However, he made the first genuine attempt to solve the problem of Algerian settlement, and his experiments were of evolutionary importance, not only because of the lessons from their failure, but because the positive benefits of the scheme played a large part in shaping the trend of later policy. Moreover, his policy of cooperating with the Arabs was half a century in advance of his era and opened up new avenues of thought. But he was ruined by his somewhat mixed reputation, by his overgreat self-confidence, and by his ultimate reversion to the force that he had at first stood out against. Bugeaud was at the parting of the ways in a military age and with a military weapon. He attempted to introduce economic and native reforms suitable for a progressive civil government, and not unnaturally he fell between his weapons and his goals. He was attempting an impossible task, but the very attempt shortened the period of transition to that stage in which the reforms that he fought for would be made practicable. Modern Algeria owes no little of its development to Pere Bugeaud, and it is no exaggeration to say that he was as successful in determining ultimate policy as he was a failure in his immediate task. Moreover, at the very least, he achieved the conquest of the land up to the mountains of Kabylie. After Bugeaud, the only unconventional spot in Algeria's history was Napoleon III's dabbling with the idea of an Arab kingdom. When his policy of exploiting the natives had become irksomely monotonous, he issued his famous letter of February 6, 1863 to Governor Pelassier, to the effect that Algeria is not, properly speaking, a colony but an Arab kingdom, and as such had to evolve along the line of native hegemony. Therefore, he turned from aiding the colonists of what use were colonists, it was argued, when most of them died, to restoring the Arabs to a fair position. Cantonment, or the forcing back of the natives to provide land for settlement, was abandoned, and the collective property of the Arabs recognized and divided among the numerous family groups, 1863. However, the upshot was failure. Napoleon, entranced for the nonce by the Arabs, had neglected the far more useful Kabylie mountaineers as rude peasants, and the natives, fiery democratic agriculturists, as they were, responded to this treatment by the rising of 1864 in Oran and Kabylie. Locusts in 1866, drought in 1867, and cholera in 1868 completed the cycle of disaster, but Napoleon's interest had waned long before this, and Algeria drifted with a discouraged settler class, a declining native population, a clearly inadequate military government, and economic distress everywhere, in short, a palpable failure. So obvious was the debacle that the Corps Legislatif sent a commission of inquiry in 1869 which recommended a complete change of methods and organization, and in particular a return to that civil government which had been tried between 1858 and 1860. This change came about in May 1870, so that the decisive step in Algerian reorganization had been taken before the proclamation of the French Republic, and it is therefore completely erroneous, although usual, to attribute the commencement of modern Algeria to the revolution of 1870. The disease had been investigated, the symptoms diagnosed, and the prescription decided upon before that event. Nevertheless, in 1871, the Republic had to face the accumulated arrears of 40 years of failure in Algeria, and in particular, a seething native population. The complications of our policy threw them out of their ordinary round. The liberty of our ideas scandalized them, and the spectacle of our civilization provoked in them a kind of malaise, and less admiration than defiant stupor. Accordingly, an organized and powerful rising broke out in Algiers and Constantine in 1871, and evoked an instant response in the perennial storm center of the Kabylie Mountains. And the point was that, unlike previous rebellions, this one was a rising of discontented natives rather than a religious government. It was a protest against the French government rather than the unbeliever, and incidentally, a dramatic spotlight on France's chief obstacle in Algeria, the presence of 2 million Arabs and Berbers fighting fanatics, all, who simply awaited favorable opportunities like the defeat of France in 1870 to raise the green banner of the jihad. In addition, in 1870, there was the resentment of the Muslims at the ill-advised enfranchisement of the 47,000 Jews in mass, and at the same time a removal of the link between government and natives by the forcing back of the Bureau Arabe, the military intelligence officers who were the pick of France's colonial personnel, and who at least personified the government and made it intimate to the natives. Instead of these sympathetic liaison officers who understood the natives to some degree, Algeria was ruled by a civil government which wished to reverse previous policy and which seized the pretext of the rebellion to sequester 400,000 hectares of the best land in Algeria, practically all the fertile region between Algiers and Constantine. The dispossessed natives, and it must be remembered that though the rebels numbered only a third of the total population at most, all had to pay the recompense, simply had to go back. Refoulement was the catchword of the day, and we shall forget their existence, the policy of the French administrators. The emphasis was once again entirely upon the European settler. Military rule had given place to civil in name in 1870, and in reality in 1879. The National Assembly in 1871 had given 100,000 hectares to Alsatians and Lorrainers, and official colonization was at its zenith soon after. France was concentrating on the effort of proving that the failure of settlement before 1870 was due to transient conditions and not to the country itself, and that the lugubriousness expressed in the view that the cemeteries are the only colonies that continually prosper in Algeria was opposed to the facts of the situation. Indeed, it was manifestly untrue after 1856, in which year the death rate was for the first time exceeded by the birth rate. And even in 1860, that is, immediately after the period of suffering, there were 205,000 Europeans in Algeria. By 1880, the number had increased to 376,000, and the agricultural revolution, a change due to the introduction of roads, markets, capital, and settlers, was in full swing. The natives still remained inert and disgruntled, witness the insurrections of 1876 and 1879, and the far more serious rising in Oran from 1881 to 1884. But the country was progressing. For the first time, the French were receiving some reward for their efforts. Indeed, the year 1879 to 1880, when civil government really came to the tell, may be taken as the turning point in the modern history of Algeria, because then the spirit of optimism appeared, and the future, from most points of view, was no longer crushingly oppressive despite the accumulated heritage of inapplicable policies which the government of the Defense Nationale had bequeathed to the Republic. The freeing of the Jews, the policy of assimilation, the retachment idea of rule from Paris, and the native policy based on a refined economic exploitation. Up to this turning point of 1880, Algerian history had been, so to speak, unilateral and undifferentiated. It was a melancholy record either of complete failure or checkered efforts. But here, after the consolidation was so obvious and the progress so unmistakable that the history of the land became diversified, there was no longer simply an Algerian policy, but several policies in various spheres. The protoplasm, which had been quiescent until 1860 and fitfully growing from 1860 to 1880, had commenced a development in all directions, a development which was far from unhindered or even uniform, but which was at least persistent and vigorous, even in time of failure. After 1880, that is, the history of Algeria must be considered sectionally, and the lessons of the various sections correlated in a kind of counting house before the general policy can be determined. The period of genesis, an unusually protracted and sterile period, was at an end, and that of realization at hand, nor could it be said that France lacked negative evidence, the evidence of repeated failure, on which to decide her future policies. Hereafter, she had to gamble on the destiny of Algeria with a credit balance of 200,000 settlers and a steadily growing trade, but a mortgage of an immutably alienated native stock and the inapplicable policy of assimilation in every branch. The issue was thus uncertain enough, but wherein it differed from the past was that it at least allowed a permanently favorable outcome to be envisaged.